Good evening, folks. We are still part of Italy Week, and this has been an exciting show I've been looking forward to for some time, because after talking about the Indian cavalry stroke reconnaissance units with Gareth on Monday, and we did the Patriots from the Barrio last night. Now it's time to talk about the SAS, and who doesn't like a juicy story about paratroopers and SAS and winged daggers. So joining me, he's been on World War II TV a couple of times before, Damien Lewis, prolific author and historian, and always working on numerous projects. Good evening, Damien. How are you?
Yeah, very good. How are you?
I'm all right. It's good. So people love your work. People love hearing you talk about this stuff. So we're going to dive straight in.
Let's go.
So Italy, winter of 44-45. Let's set the scene. It's been a terrible winter in terms of the weather, mud, cold. The Allies are pushing up, but not quite as fast as they were hoping to. The Germans have been building line after line of defenses, and a mission props up that is kind of offered to the SAS. So how did you, before we get into it, how did you find out about this story? What was your first little inroad into it?
Do you know, I can't even remember. That's a terrible answer, but it's absolutely true. I can't remember now. I mean, I remember the daughter of the main hero of the book actually lives just down the road from me. So one of this kind of like watershed moments was finding her and making contact with her. I think that's when it became really viable as a book. But you know, that whole winter 44 campaign, you know, Churchill's, you know, famously quoted as saying that Italy was going to be the soft underbelly of Europe, and of course it wasn't at all. You know, Hitler actually sent some of his best units, his best divisions to it, his best mountain troops, his best armor, because he said, you know, we cannot let you know, Italy fall. You know, not only would it be a southern route into the Reich, but he just would not see it happen. So you had really battle-hardened, capable, well-equipped troops there. That's the first thing. Second thing is you had these lines of defences, and the Allies just kept knocking up against these, you know, pillboxes, barbed wire, gun emplacements, tunnels. I've actually been there. I've been through some of these tunnels, and they're unbelievable. You know, they're right tunnel deep into the mountains. These were pretty close to impregnable. And so come winter 44, you know, Allied forces are bogged down on the Gothic Line. You've got it there shown on the map. And this was the string of defenses along the Apennine Mountains, which was, you know, which had proved impregnable. And so that winter, that autumn, Allied commanders realized that they needed, you know, they'd promised to Churchill and Roosevelt that they'd be through Italy by Christmas, and it wasn't happening. And so they realized they needed something new, something different to try and get through the Gothic Line come the spring offensive, which would kind of kick off, I guess, you know, February, March 45. And so the concept they came up with was to drop these SOE agents, Special Operations Executive Agents, Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare, British agents. Well, not just British. I mean, look, lots of SOE were French, you know, Yugoslav, Czechs. So a multinational grouping to drop these SOE agents behind the Gothic Line with the idea that they would link up with the Italian resistance and find some ways to foment chaos and collapse in the enemy's rear. And so that would help us break through the Gothic Line. And
it's worth mentioning at that point that by that part of the war, with the end is in sight now, all over Europe, the resistance units are getting stronger and bigger and more confident because they feel that this end is in sight. And also, I think to add that we've talked about it on the shows earlier this week, Kesselring's idea that if we are going to lose Italy, let's make sure we make the Allies pay for every step with as many lives as they can. And I think when you look at the Italian campaign, it has cost a higher price than perhaps the Allies had considered when Sicily went pretty well, all things considered, came kind of under budget, I suppose. And then Italy, the wheels fell off a little bit as well. So yeah, there's lots of things happening by that winter. The weather's had the impact and the lives lost. And so, yeah, things have to change. So yeah, we're coming into sort of the nub of the book then. It's Operation Tombola. It's on the site of the story we're talking about is on the map there, folks. And I'll hand back to you to explain what the purpose was, really.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, Kesselring had vowed to Hitler that Italy wouldn't fall, remember? And he was so enraged about the effectiveness of the Italian partisan operations. You know, these were everything from Italian royalists through to Italian communists, kind of united loosely in an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi coalition. And Kesselring was enraged at their effectiveness. He reckoned that anything up to 20,000 German troops had been killed by partisan operations, and he had got so apoplectic, and Hitler also, that they'd ordered that for any German killed by partisans, they would kill 10 Italians. And there are villages in Italy which were completely wiped out, men, women, children, the village priest, everyone wiped out by the SS and Gestapo in reprisals for partisan raids. So it was to link up with those partisans that in just after Christmas 44, an SOE operative, a Captain Mike Lees, born of a very distinguished Dorset family, as it happens, who lived just down the road from me by pure chance. Lees was parachuted behind the lines to link up with the local partisans. And a little bit of background on Lees, because he is the most extraordinary character, and really he's the standout hero of the book. Lees he'd not been invited into the SOE, and bear in mind you could only join the Tweed Cap Boys, as they were known, by the nod and the wink and the handshake. You can't advertise for people to be recruited to a secret organization. It's self-evident, and SOE was deniable and covert operations, and so you could only join if you knew somebody, the old boys network. And Lees was in North Africa, and he was chaffing the bit to get involved in operations, and he heard about on the grapevine about the SO, and he was desperate to get in when he realized that there was a room in Nazi-occupied Europe for him and the enemy, i.e. he could parachute behind the lines. And so he walked into a bar, located one of these SOE guys having some R&R. This was in Cairo, and got the guy steaming drunk, found out all his personal details, found out where the SOE office was locally, walked in there the next day, and blagged his way in, claiming to be the best school friend of that guy who had just gone on holiday, so couldn't counter Lees's story. And he was so convincing, he was recruited, and he was deployed first to Yugoslavia. And in Yugoslavia, Lees was co-located with the Chetniks, and he led a load of Chetnik, sabotage operations on rail transport, German rail transport. And then eventually, of course, he was ordered to stop operating with the Chetniks because of false propaganda. Churchill was convinced the Chetniks weren't doing the fighting the partisans were in Yugoslavia, and so the Chetniks were dropped. Lees was incensed by this, and so because his orders said you must stop operations with the Chetniks, he went off and carried out half a dozen solo sabotage operations on his own, blowing up German trains literally single-handedly, and in the process of which he earned the nickname Mike Wildman Lees. And so come the autumn of 44, when they're looking for someone of a certain ilk to parachute behind the Gothic Line, Lees is the man for the job. Highly, highly regarded by SOE, a man really going places. And actually, SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, have already tried to steal him from SOE, and the SOE have said, no, sorry, you can't have him until the end of the war, then you can. So a man of towering reputation in SOE. So Lees is parachuted into near the village of Secchio, just behind the Gothic Line, to link up with the local partisans. And this is where the story goes kind of pear-shaped, because in theory, what was happening was the Allies were dropping weaponry, food, and equipment to the partisans to arm them, to rise up in the rear of the enemy and cause havoc and chaos. But in practice, what had happened that autumn is there had been something of a change of heart in Whitehall. And basically, the mandarins at the Foreign Office had started to wonder if it was really a particularly good idea dropping in all this weaponry to Italian partisans, some at least of whom were nominally communist. And so they fomented this unspoken, unpublicized change of plan that they would stop dropping in weapons and food and ammunition. So when Lees arrives on the ground in Secchio, having parachuted in the middle of the winter in the snows, expecting to find several hundred well-armed, well-equipped, fighting fit partisans. He finds instead a bunch of Italian would-be partisans who've not had a supply drop since September that year. So they've had no weapons, no ammo, no food, no boots, nothing for approaching 6 months. And he's absolutely shocked and gobsmacked. So he's there.
Sorry to crazy to jump in there, but it's come up in my Resistance Week a couple of weeks ago that the higher ups are planning in true chess fashion. They're planning a post-war and later on. Yet the war's not over. If you're there in Italy, if you're in Yugoslavia, if you're in France or the Netherlands, the war is still very much exactly as it's been for 4 years. It's wise on some levels to think about the next step, but not if you're actually an operative on the ground there who's still got the bloody war to win. And I'm glad you talked about Lisa's personality and this way of being inventive with regards to rules, and because it's all going to come into the story later on, and we won't spoil all of it, but the SOE, the nature of the people they want is they are people who think outside the box. They break the rules. They're unconventional. You're not going to win the war in this environment with office workers, and yet sometimes this comes back to bite you in the arse later on. We'll get there later on.
Absolutely. I mean, SOE went out to recruit misfits and mavericks and free thinkers. You cannot recruit those kind of people to wage war and then expect them to play by all the rules. In fact, Churchill said, this is a total war. We will only defeat the Nazis if we wage total war. And to wage total war, we need people who are willing and ready to break all the rules. And in fact, you will only get recruited into the SOE if you are willing to break all the rules. So if you recruit a bunch of mavericks and rule breakers, expect them to go into the field and be mavericks and break the rules. So Lys arrives on the ground and he finds the opposite of what he was expecting. And just after he's arrived, the Germans launch what they call a rastrellamento, which is a raking through. So they send in 10,000 troops, proper German troops, to hunt down the partisans. And Lys watches from the mountaintops these groups of would-be partisans throwing away what little weaponry they do have and running off into the hills, to hide in the snows, understandably. And a lesser man, a less independently minded individual, would have perhaps wanted to give up at that stage. Lys, once he's managed to escape the enemy dragnet, sees a golden opportunity. He sees a golden opportunity because he thinks, right, the Germans have just shattered any illusion that this is a coherent fighting force. Now is my moment to seize command and shape this force in my image as I see it, as I see how it will actually be successful and operate. And so one of the first things he does after the Germans had left is he calls together one of the few commanders he respects and says, look, no, that's not right. He didn't disrespect these Italian partisan commanders, but he knew they'd been dealt a very, very bad hand of cards. But one of them in particular has impressed him. And he says to him, look, I need you to go and recruit for me 20 of your best fighters. We're going to form our own special forces. And they gave it the name the Black Owls. So that's the first thing he did. And the second thing he did was he realized that amongst the partisans, there weren't just male fighters. There were obviously young Italian women as well. And as young Italian women often are, they were very attractive. And so Lys called together these female partisans and said, I need volunteers to form an intelligence gathering unit. You are going to be it. I'm going to call you the staffetters, the messengers. And what you're going to do in your very nicest clothes, you're going to get on your bikes, you're going to cycle through all the local German garrisons, you're going to stop and flirt and scrounge cigarettes off the German sentries, and you're going to gather intelligence for me, because I want a target that will change the course of this war, that will enable this breakthrough. And he said, you go and find it for me. And very quickly they bicycled off, and the intelligence started flowing back into Lys's Setu HQ. In fact, so much intelligence that he was having to burn the midnight hours actually trying to assess it all. And all the time he's thinking, which of these targets do I choose? Which one will really, knock 7 bells of crap out of the enemy? And he hears that there is a headquarters locally that Kesselring is a regular weekly attendee at, because from there he has a hotline to Berlin to speak to Hitler. and there are other top German generals there. And this headquarters commands something like 100,000 troops along the Gothic Line. And he thinks, this is extraordinary. If I can find this headquarters and I can recce it and find out its defenses, maybe this is the target I'm looking for. And so he sends his staffetters out, and there was one who had grey eyes, striking grey eyes, he and his fellow SOE had a radio operator there called Bert Faramond. They used to say you could see all of the world in her eyes. Very, very striking. And she went out one evening and didn't come back to the following day. And she had cycled to the local German base, and she had seduced the German officer. And in the process of doing so, she had managed to extract from him chapter and verse about the headquarters that Lee sought intelligence on. So she comes back and she tells him everything she's learned, including its location. And then again, in the measure of the man, so Lees was 6'2" at least, a very, very, and a rugby player at school, a very physical individual, very imposing individual, towered over the other partisans largely. So Lees manages to find a local cape, which is big enough to hide himself and his Bren gun under. And that's him there in the cape. And he treks all the way through the Italian foothills, out of partisan territory into German territory, all the way through the foothills onto the plains, until he is at the Casa del Lupo, the House of the Wolf, the last kind of farmstead overlooking the plains, from which he can see the two headquarters buildings. And they were called the Villa Rossi and the Villa Calvi, the White Villa and the Red Villa. And they were these fortress-like buildings, two of them, one of which housed the headquarters, the radio room, the maps room, all the normal accoutrements you'd imagine of a headquarters building, and the Villa Rossi, the Red Villa in the foreground there, which was the headquarters where the generals billeted themselves, including Kesselring from time to time. And having viewed it, Farran understood the daunting nature of what they were contemplating, because you can see the two villas there, but what you can't see is the defenses. There were anything up to 1,000 German troops defending this headquarters, with everything up to heavy armor, anti-aircraft guns, machine gun posts. This was a veritable fortress. The Germans never for one moment imagined that anybody would manage to get there and attack it, but even so, they had fearsome defenses there. And so Lees returns from that incredible reconnaissance mission, knowing that, well, two things. One, he needs to lick his partisans into shape, obviously, and get them properly armed. But secondly, he knows they cannot take this on their own. He needs a tip of the spear. He needs some stormtroopers to actually lead this force, to make them believe in themselves. So he sends a message back to headquarters in Florence. SOE headquarters says, look, I found the target. It's the German headquarters. But I need something. I need some commandos. I need unit commandos or something similar to enable me to go and take it on. And it just so happens that when Farran sends his message through, a legendary SAS figure, Major Roy Farran, highly decorated already, already a figure of renown within the regiment, is in the headquarters building in Florence, just newly arrived with a fresh squadron of SAS troops, and he's desperate for a mission. And Farran sees Lees's radio message and says, this is the mission for me.
And just to jump in, would it be fair to say that by this point of the war, although the SAS have had some successful missions, they've all been rather small? I mean, nothing. I mean, that's maybe belittling the operations, but there's not been a really massive feeling a blow that you can actually say this changed. It came up in Resistance Week last week.
Absolutely.
Kind of talking. Did any of this stuff make a difference? You kind of go, well, possibly not. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. But I mean, bear in mind, they weren't set up to do this kind of operation. No. They were set up to do small scale operations deep behind the lines, air bases hit and run, roads, railways. That's what they were set up to do. So this is not. This is a totally atypical SAS operation.
Yeah.
You know, in fact, it shouldn't have been. You know, it's something that the SAS shouldn't have taken on. But that was Farran through and through. In fact, Farran and Lease were like a marriage made in heaven. They were birds of a feather. They were both maverick rule breakers. And actually, the guy who was the SOE commander in Florence said, "Farran and Lease is a marriage made in hell." He says, if Farran gets into the field, we will never be able to put this genie back into the bottle, right? So they know what they're unleashing, okay? And Farran goes to the local military commander, who's actually American, because oddly, the SAS were under command of the local American colonel. And he says, look, you know, we'd like to take this operation on. I need your clearance to deploy into the field. And the American colonel says, well, your squadron can, but you can't. He said, because we are so depleted of experienced senior SAS commanders, I need you to remain here to guide operations. And it was a fair point. You know, by that time of the war, a lot of the SAS guys had been, you know, they've been deployed on back-to-back operations, sometimes, you know, several in a month, deep behind the lines for 4 years. So that the attrition rate was enormous. And so the American colonel says, no, you can't go, Major Farran, but your men can. And Farran says, well, that's fine, sir. Do you mind if I go fly in on the C-47 to see my men off, because it would be rude not to? Which the American commander goes, yes, of course you can, Major Farran. And so Farran mounts up the C-47 American aircrew and aircraft and flies in with a band of 40, a squadron of SAS troops and all their kit. And of course, when he gets over the drop zone, Farran is the first to jump out the door with his parachute. And he says to the American aircrew, you will go back to Florence and you will tell your commander that I was helping dispatch my men and I accidentally fell out of the aircraft in that process. And of course, the American aircrew knew that by saying that, everyone would presume he was dead. And he said, well, that's as maybe, but that's what you will go and tell them. And so Farran parachutes in to link up with Lease with his 40 SAS raiders. But back in Florence, when the aircrew return, you know, the news is that Major Farran's fallen out of the aircraft by accident and is dead. And he was officially reported killed in action. On the ground, Farran and Lease gather at Secchio, at Lease's headquarters, building, and they contemplate this raid. And they are both extremely, well, two things, extremely excited and extremely daunted, because they have 40 SAS raiders, several hundred very badly armed and ill-disciplined, you could argue, partisans, and let's just look at the makeup of those partisans, because that is extraordinary in itself. You think they're Italian partisans? No. There are hundreds of Italian partisans, but there are also at least 100 Russians. Okay, how did the Russians end up with the Italian partisans? Because what happened was the Russians captured on the Eastern Front those that weren't murdered by the Eitzans group and the death squads, or sent to the concentration camps to be liquidated, were given a choice, and they were said, okay, it was said, look, you can either be exterminated, or you can join the work gangs, or you can fight with the German military. And so these Russians in Italy are ones who were actually on the Gothic Line, being used as slave labor, basically, to build the defenses, reinforce it, who had escaped and come to join the partisans. And they were led by a very colorful Russian former lieutenant called Viktor Pirogov. And Lease looks at the Russians and says, these are fighting troops. We can use these guys. We just need to arm them properly and motivate them. Then there are half a dozen or a dozen former Spanish Civil War veterans who somehow have made their way to join the Italian partisans. There's several former French foreign legionnaires. There's even a Dutch sergeant called Fritz Schnapper, who, when Holland got overrun by the Nazis, decided to come to the UK to carry on the fight, and somehow thought he could get there via Switzerland and Italy, and ended up with partisans. So this is a polyglot multinational force that they somehow have to lick into shape to take down the German army headquarters defended by 1,000 troops. And Farran, like Lease, this is why they were such a good pairing. They both had this innate understanding of human nature, of what makes men and women believe they can fight. Okay, and so Farran says, he sends he breaks silence. He sends a message back to headquarters and says, yes, I'm alive, and I need you to send me all this equipment. And some of the key things he asked for Scottish Transvaal Regiment hackles, so feathers, which happened to be, you're wearing your beret, which happened to be the same color as the Italian flag. So all the partisans can wear these hackles and it give them a sense of identity. He asked for uniforms. The list of weaponry is extensive. It includes everything up to 75mm pack howitzers, these reasonably heavy guns that you could break down, carry on your back, and then reassemble in the field. Farran sends his shopping list through to SOE headquarters. And of course, the reaction there is, how on earth are you still alive? And Farran says, well, when I fell out of the aircraft accidentally, because I was dispatching, I happened to have a parachute on my back, so I pulled the ripcord and I came down and I'm all right. So back at headquarters, they are determined to court-martial him because they don't believe it, obviously. And Farran says, look, I'm here now. I can't get back. You can't put me back on the aircraft and send me back home. So let me lead this operation and let's fight the enemy. That's what we're here for, surely. And so, headquarters know they have been stumped, and they start to fly in the weaponry that he's asked for. And they start to train and train and train. And again, in a kind of indication of the inspired genius of these two commanders, after they've trained this multinational force and got them to shape where they believe that they can actually maybe stand a chance of taking on the target, they start to consider the ramifications, and they start to think, what will happen if we succeed? If we succeed in going into that headquarters and destroying it, but more importantly, killing the generals, the German generals, the reprisals will be, well, nothing ever like it will have been seen. They will just destroy and murder and burn across villages all across northern Italy. So Farran sends a message to headquarters, says, I need a piper. Find me a bagpiper. And so there is this young 18-year-old chap who was already known as David the Mad Piper Kirkpatrick, based in Scotland. He's been put into the stores because he's piped ashore several commando landings, and his commanding officers has decided he's risked enough already and he should be in stores for a while to kind of keep him safe. But upon Farran's request, his commanding officer comes to him and says, David, would you like a wee job? And David Kirkpatrick says, well, if it'll get me out of stores, I'll go anywhere. And so David the Mad Piper Kirkpatrick is the last honorary SAS soldier to be parachuted into the field. And he parachutes in just a few days before the operation is launched in full Highland regalia. Okay, it's at night. So you've got these Italians marking the drop zone with flares, which light up the scene. And they see this figure dropping in what they presume is a skirt. And they think, why are the British dropping in women? We have our own staffettas, our own Italian women. What's going on? And then Farran gets David Kirkpatrick to pipe a Highland marching tune as soon as he lands on the DZ, and the Italians suddenly get it. They're dancing, very, very demonstrative as Italians are. They're dancing. They're joyful. They're inspired. Nothing inspires like the skirl of the pipes. But for Farran, it's the masterstroke, because he intends to get Kirkpatrick to play throughout the assault. The Germans will not be able, in his view, and Farran's and Lisa's view, to claim it is not a British raid if you've got a bagpiper playing the bagpipes all the way through. So that's their plan. And having got this polyglot, multinational, DIY force of not very many men, just a few hundred men, a few hundred raiders, worked up into a fever pitch of self-belief, where they believe they're part of something extraordinary and where they believe they can go and pull this raid off, that they set off into the field to undertake this trek, which is going to take in itself several days to get to the target. Now, bear in mind, there is a tendency to think the Italians, how can I put this politely, weren't perhaps the most robust during the war. Well, there are enemies for the large part of it, and then our allies. Okay, let's think about. So let's just consider something for a moment. if you're one of those Italian partisans and the raid doesn't go to plan and you get captured, what will happen to you? Well, you'll get tortured horrendously by the Gestapo and the SS, and then eventually you'll be committed to the Nacht und Nebel, the night and the fog. This order Hitler had for any resistance and partisans and actually also special forces who were captured, you will be disappeared without trace, Nacht und Nebel, night and fog. But not only that, because Hitler's ordered 10 Italians will die for every German, they'll come for your village, they'll come for your family. The ramifications for you as an individual, as an Italian partisan, are utterly horrendous. Now, Farran, Lees, and the SAS guys, well, they could also have been committed to the Nacht und Nebel if captured, but they were British soldiers, bona fide British troops operating in uniform. Had they been captured by the Wehrmacht, the German army, they stood a good chance of being treated as bona fide prisoners of war. So the Italian partisans are risking hell. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when we did Resistance Week a couple of weeks ago, that's the thing we should never forget, is that it's not, if you're a soldier landing on D-Day or landing in Sicily or fighting in Burma, your family is safe wherever they are back home generally. But if you're a partisan or resistance worker or a SOE agent, you've maybe got parents and a sister and a cousin and your next door neighbor, and all of those could be implicated as well. You could make the point that by this point of the war, the Germans are seeing that the writing is on the wall and they're not being perhaps as zealous as they were a year earlier. But that's no guarantee of compliance. I mean, we still see atrocities happening in the Netherlands. I did the show with Sophie Poldermans last week. They're still capturing Dutch resistance workers and killing them in April 45. You know, the war is as good as over. If the SS want to be bastards, they still will be. Nothing's going to stop them. So,
but bear in mind, they're under orders. You know, Hitler's commando order is very clear, and it says if you do not implement this order, you will be called before the High Command, and you will basically yourself fall foul of it. Yeah. So the risks are very real. So that's what Farran and Lees have achieved. They've somehow got these few hundred partisans to this fever pitch of self-belief, and it's an incredible achievement. And as they set off, they're 24 hours into that trek in towards the headquarters. Lees has got malaria, which he contracted first in Yugoslavia. So he is very sick. He shouldn't even be going. He refuses not to go. And they get to the last village before they have to cross over into German territory, German occupied territory. And a small 12-year-old boy comes running through the crowd and thrusts a note into Lees's hand. And so Lees opens it and reads it, and he has to read it twice before he can really even believe that it might be for real. And cut long story short, the note says you are to stand the operation down. So Lees stands there thinking, okay, what do I do? If I stop this now, we will never get this force of partisans worked up to this fever pitch of self-belief ever again. And not only that, they will lose all belief, all faith in us as commanders. Mm. And he looks at Lees and he thinks, well, there's no way I can ask Lees to be part of this decision, because he's got malaria and he can't even think straight, let alone fight straight. And anyway, I'm a major, he's a captain, I'm the senior commander. And so Farran decides unilaterally, again, mark of the man, to put the message in his pocket and decide that it was never received. So without saying a word to anyone, knowing that he already faces a court-martial anyway for jumping out the aircraft against orders, how can they court-martial him more than once? He decides they will go ahead anyway. And so they set off on the trek into the Badlands, into the plains that lead to the villas they're going to assault. And that trek in itself is an extraordinary achievement, because they get all these several dozen Russian, Italian, British raiders to the target, to the last outpost, the Casa del Lupo, the House of the Wolf, the farmhouse overlooking the village, without any of them being detected. And that in itself is an incredible achievement. And it's then that Farran gives, that evening, before they go in on the assault under cover of darkness, he gives his orders, and they are, let's be frank about it, they are very dark. He basically says, let's not make no mistake. You are going in there tonight to kill everybody. They're not taking any prisoners. This is murder most foul. Okay, that's his words are very, very, very stark. And so when they set off at midnight, when they come down from the last highlands onto the plain to start moving in, Farran is at point. He's the lead man, and he's navigating them by what they call pacing and bearing. So that means you take a compass bearing, and you count your paces. You know roughly that each pace is perhaps a meter. You keep a mental note of where you are in your head, and that's the only means you have of navigating to your target. And they're trying to get to the crescent. See that woodland there, the crescent-shaped woodland just to the west of the villas. They're trying to get to that position where they will muster before dividing forces and attacking. And sure enough, that's it. Farran navigates the force to that patch of woodland, to that cover, without any of them being discovered. And as they're mustering in that woodland, Farran brings himself just south of it to the road, which is going to be like his headquarters position with David Kirkpatrick. He sends Lys to the Villa Rossi with half of his force, and he sends a Rhodesian 19-year-old Lieutenant Harvey. Okay, so let me just repeat that. A Rhodesian 19-year-old Lieutenant Harvey to attack the Villa Calvi. So he is leading the assault, a 19-year-old SAS man. He's leading half of the assault force to attack there. And then he also sends 30 of Victor Modena's Russians south of the two villas to block the road leading to the villas, so they are to stop the reinforcements getting there. And Lys Farran basically says, sorry, you will start your assault in 3 minutes' time, move out. And as Lieutenant Harvey moves his force into the Villa Calvi, they're carrying a bazooka, which had been parachuted into them, which is about the heaviest piece of firepower they have. And the idea of the bazooka is they're going to use it to blast through the wooden doors of the Villa Calvi. And it's the firing of that bazooka which will kind of launch both assaults. So Harvey and his men get in position, and they load the bazooka and they fire off the first round, and it hits the door and it doesn't explode. Apparently, the bazooka had that problem that the ammunition was not particularly reliable. They fire a second bazooka, hits the door, doesn't explode, and at that point they hear boots on the gravel path leading to the villa, and so they know it's a patrol. So Harvey moves to the gates. He's got a Bren gun. He sees a German patrol approaching. He has no choice but to open fire. He kills all of that German patrol, and then obviously the whole night turns into bloody murder and mayhem. And at the Villa Rossi, of course, because the assault has kicked off slightly early with Lieutenant Harvey's gunfire, they're now running in to attack that position, Lys in the lead, under heavy fire, and they burst in through the windows and the doors of the Villa Rossi, and the fight very quickly becomes, they seize the ground fall very quickly, but the fight very quickly becomes to get up the staircase, large ornate wooden staircase, to the upper floors where the senior commanders, the German generals, are sleeping, to kill them. And Lys and others lead that charge. And as they're charging up that staircase, Lys and 2 or 3 others are hit in a withering hail of fire. In fact, Lys has led several charges up that staircase, and eventually he is also gunned down. And in the confusion, the senior officer left alive down on the ground floor says, and this is what Farran has said to them before they set out. He says, if you cannot get to the upper floors, you're to burn them alive. You're to burn the place down. And so in the Villa Rossi, those who are still alive set fire to the ground floor, and a conflagration starts to engulf the building. No one can find Lys. They're going to have to leave him for dead, and they start to evacuate the building. In the Villa Calvi, the actual radio room and headquarters building, Harvey has also fought his way inside. They've had more success there in terms of killing the German staff officer based there. And they've also, as they withdraw, they're also setting fire to the radio room, the library, all the things that have been burned have been piled up there. They've gone outside into the outhouse. They found petrol. They're turning the place into a raging inferno. And back at the Villa Rossi, as the last of the men withdraw, and it's now burning very, very fiercely. They see a figure on all fours crawling towards the doorway, and it's a SOE Captain Michael Leese. He's been shot 5 times, so it's a miracle he's still alive. And he says to the men who find him, "You leave me. There's no way you can get me out, and I'm finished anyway. But save yourselves." And against orders, 2 or 3 of them refuse. And what they do instead is they go into the orchards, they find a ladder, they bring it back, they strap Mike Leese to the ladder, and bear in mind he's 6'2" and weighs about 15 stone at least. And then they carry him under intense fire, because you can imagine the hornet's nest that has now been stirred up, out of the Villa Rossi, through the orchard, down onto the plains, and they manage to get out of the immediate dragnet. And eventually they find a farmstead to which they're led by the local Italian resistance, where they know the old lady who owns the farm is sympathetic to the Allied cause. They take Mike Leese inside. They build a hay bale kind of hide in which to leave him. And they say, basically, you stay here. We will have to go. We will find people to, the local resistance will come and bring you medical care and rescue you. Do not lose heart, but we have to leave you. And so that's where they leave Leese. And then they all are supposed to rendezvous back at the Casa del Lupo, the House of the Wolf, so they can start their exfiltration. Now, bear in mind, the raid itself, as they make their way out of there, both villas are burning. You can hear already ambulances on the road trying to make their way into the villas to collect the wounded. It's chaos behind them. But now, of course, they've got at least a 24-hour trek ahead of them through enemy territory, which is crawling with an arranged enemy. So this is just really the beginning of the incredible assault story. And Farran gathers his men at the Casa del Lupo, and they're issued, the SAS in the war, SOE as well, were issued with something called Benny's, benzodrine, which is speed, basically. It's an amphetamine. And basically he says, start necking benzodrine like Smarties, because we got a long way ahead of us, many miles on foot to fare, and we're going to be hunted all the way. And somehow, and it's hard to understand how, it beggars belief, he manages, force marching his men, to get every single one of those who got out of the raid back into partisan territory alive, without them being captured. And even then, that's not the end of the hunt, because the Germans know where they are. They know where these partisans are headquartered. So they send in a significant force to basically come through the partisans' valleys and attack them. Farran and Leese have foreseen that this is going to happen. And so they've left more than half their force back in the partisan strongholds with really well-enforced gun positions, so they can repulse the enemy when they come. So there's a running battle. It lasts for several days, and eventually the German counterattack is foiled. And that really leaves Mike Leese in his farm building, shot 5 times, waiting for help. And what happens with Leese? Again, it's just one chapter in the most extraordinary tale. Leese basically he has 2 Italian female partisans come to him to give him medical treatment, and then a doctor comes and says, "Look," he says, "you've got very, very serious nerve damage in your thigh." He says, "If you don't get to proper medical attention, that means a hospital within the next 10 days, you will either lose the use of your legs or you will die." And so Farran at least thinks, well, there's only 2 options. One, I give myself up to the enemy. They might give me, hospital care. Or 2, I try and get myself back to Allied lines. Shot 5 times in the middle of absolute pandemonium. The enemy are hunting for him everywhere. What on earth does he do? And then the local Italian resistance leader turns up, and he says, "I have an idea. Be ready tomorrow morning. I hope I'll bring a solution for you." And the next morning, Leese is there in hiding, and he sees this figure entering his room in German uniform. In fact, it's in a German medic's uniform. And he goes to grab his pistol, and the Italian partisan leader starts laughing. He says, "It's all right, it's me." And what's happened is the Italian partisans have been out on the road. They've hijacked a German ambulance, one of the ambulances that's ferrying the wounded from the headquarters assault to hospital. Okay, they've stripped the German ambulance staff and drivers. They've dressed themselves as German medics. They now dress Lise in a German army uniform. They put him in the back of the ambulance, and using that as their cover, they drive Lise all the way through the German lines, several dozen kilometers through enemy, crawling with troops, searching for Michael Lise, who's in the back of the ambulance. They bluff their way through the lines until they get out of German territory into the nearest partisan terrain.
And just to jump in here for a second,
yeah,
Dan,
go on.
Because I mean, let you have a break because you've been talking for 15 minutes, whatever it is. But yeah, I think when and by the way, folks, I should stress you're only getting about 10% of the story. That's the thickness of the book. There, you're getting the absolute. This is the match of the day highlights you're getting now. The full match is definitely worth watching. But the fact when I was reading it, the fact they were able to get through the German lines, I think, is an indication of how much success this raid has had, because the German command is falling apart. They're looking, but there's no organization to it. It's not working properly. It's not working efficiently.
Paul, you're absolutely right.
If the operation hadn't worked, they'd have been swept up. The fact they get through is because there's too many Indians now, not enough chiefs.
Not only that, but they've evacuated the headquarters. They're so speechless and shocked that the Allies can have struck so far behind the lines. They evacuate that headquarters. If you look at the radio transcripts from that HQ, the night of the raid, there's a last radio broadcast message. It's 15 days before the headquarters comes back on air, because it takes 15 days for them to relocate it to somewhere else. And during all that period, it's like a headless chicken. You're absolutely right. So the enemy are shocked and they're reeling. And they're taking Lise to a tiny mountaintop airstrip. And again, another just mind-blowing part of the story. There's a Italian Air Force ace who's been highly decorated by the Germans for shooting down Allied aircraft, called Furio Lori. Okay, brilliant flyer. The SOE have heard about him and they've recruited him to fly operations for the SOE. Okay, so they go to Furio Lori, and they've also captured a German Fiesler Stork light spotter plane. And they say to Furio Lori, "Are you willing to fly from Florence across the Gothic Line to this tiny little mountain airstrip to rescue a very badly injured SOE officer?" And so, sure enough, Furio Lori gets in his Stork, former German Luftwaffe aircraft, flies across the Gothic Line, lands on this impossible. It takes 5 attempts to land with the Stork, which is in itself, it's a specialist short takeoff and landing aircraft. So to take 5 attempts, it's like landing on a matchbox. They load Lise inside. Okay, he flies him back across the Gothic Line and delivers him to a hospital in Rome. And that's how Lise's life is saved. Now, if you propose that story, that plot line in a thriller, some say, "Come on, mate."
Well, I was just thinking that, because you've been a journalist reporting news. You do these non-fiction military histories, and you also write novels. Your fictional stuff isn't as crazy as the real stuff.
No.
If you submitted this as a fictional story, they go fuck off.
You're
mad. You're drinking too much. You're taking too much drugs. You've got too many characters in this from different nations. Go away.
That would never happen. That's what they'd say. But it's all documented. And Furio Lori, he's a hero in Italy to this day. In fact, his aircraft, that very Fiesler Stork aircraft, is again an amazing part of the story. After the war, a British collector bought it, right, and semi-restored it. And then sometimes the Italian government thought, we should really find that aircraft. That's a really important part of our history. There it is. They found the British collector, right? They made him an offer. He sold it back to the Italians, and it's now in a aeronautical museum just outside of Rome. That's the very aircraft that Lise was rescued in. So Lise's been pulled out. A miracle that he survived. A miracle he's out of enemy hands. And now Farran receives his orders. Okay. And his orders are: the breakthrough has begun. In this 15-day window, when the headquarters is off air, there's no orders, there's chaos, the breakthrough's already started. What we want you to do is we're going to parachute in jeeps, and we want you to go and just cause chaos and havoc behind enemy lines. And so that's exactly what happens. They load up, and the way they parachute these jeeps in is absolutely brilliant. winch them up into the bomb bay of a 4-engined heavy, and then with a parachute on each corner and a metal pan that they land on with springs, they parachute them into Lys. And with jeeps, with bullock carts full of supplies, him, the partisans, the Russians, they all set off to wreak havoc and chaos behind enemy lines. And they have with them they're towing these pack howitzers. So not only can they carry out traditional special forces raiding operations, but also what they do, and again, such inspired inventiveness, such lateral thinking. Farran says, right, what we're going to do is we're going to just get to a mountaintop, find a good target, we're going to lob in 3 dozen howitzer shells in quick succession, and then we're going to disappear, because the enemy will think that's the heavy armor and tanks of the Americans, the British having broken through, and they'll just all run away. And that's exactly what they keep doing, just lobbing a load of howitzer shells in and making the enemy believe the lines have broken. And lo and behold, the Gothic line is broken and the Allies break through. And the really one of the many fabulous things about it is that the American commander who comes through, he seeks Farran out, and in the field, he decorates Farran with a high valor an American high valor medal. Okay, that is the reason why Farran isn't court-martialed. Remember, he jumped out the plane without orders. He disobeyed orders not to raid the headquarters. Okay, and they just can't court-martial him because the senior American commander has given him a high valor medal. There is a distinct possibility that the reason they cancelled the order to assault the headquarters was because, as you know, there were back-channel discussions going on between very senior figures in Allied command and government and Kesselring to negotiate a surrender. Okay, and it's possible they thought Farran and Lys were going to go and kill Kesselring. When those negotiations were actually, Kesselring had already been removed from theatre. He had been sent to the Western Front to command some operations there. It was a new commander in charge, but that may be why they did the stand down order. But beside the point, the raid was a runaway success, and the American commander in charge of the forces that break through the Gothic line decorates Farran in the field. It's an amazing story of somebody doing what he believed was right, fighting the enemy in every way he felt possible, which was what he was charged to do and recruited to do, and saying to hell with what happens to me, what the consequences might be. And incidentally, the guy who rescues Lys, the SAS guy who disobeys orders and rescues Lys on the ladder, he also gets an MC for doing that. So, those who did the right thing, not what they were ordered, not the thing to protect their career, but the thing that was the right thing to do on the ground in the field, they do get their just reward in the end. Some of them, at least.
And this is where, again, reality and fiction, because if this was a fictional story, you would give it a completely happy, it's had the happy ending in the sense that the mission has been a complete roaring success and they've done what they're supposed to do, but you would then have you'd write that final scene of the meeting in the pub after the war, and the man meeting his girlfriend again and going off and having babies, whatever it was. But of course, in reality, Lys doesn't have the kind of the hero's treatment he should have had.
No.
So explain a little bit about the fallout. This fallout of sending in these independently minded, was about the politest way of saying it, renegades, is that the higher ups, especially as the war starts coming to an end, the higher ups, the stuffy people start taking charge again, don't they? You can be a bit a renegade when the war is being won, but when it's been won, it goes back to the office people, isn't it? So explain what happens to poor old Lys there.
Yeah, there's that saying, isn't there? These men should be kept in metal cages and only let out at times of war. Well, you could argue Lys and Farran were of that ilk. And so Lys is languishing in hospital. Obviously, he's very, very, very badly injured. What he doesn't know is that he's not getting the specialist treatment that he needs for his nerve damage. And it's only when his family managed to pull very, very high strings, pretty much up to the level of Churchill, that he gets moved from a general hospital in the UK to a specialist nerve hospital, by which time, you know, the nerve damage is pretty much irreversible. But even worse, the thing that really, the shocker, is that Farran has written Lise up for a military cross. You could argue it should have been a higher level decoration for what Lise did, but he's been written up for a military cross. And the citation is, you know, very, very, you know, powerful. And the citation gets approved all the way up until a certain level, and then it's turned down. And not only is it turned down, but the way it's turned down, you know, when I read the documents in the archives, I was kind of just, my chin was on the floor. You know, there was a concerted campaign to blacken this man's name and reputation. You know, I told you, didn't I? In October, November 44, when they chose him for the mission, he was a high flyer. He was he was a golden boy. A few months later, having pulled off the most extraordinary exploits and with courage and daring, you know, that you couldn't write. He's then, the campaign to blacken his name is so extensive. They even write to his parent unit, the Dorset Yeomanry, which Lises have served in since time immemorial, sending these allegations. He's a liar. He didn't do the things he said he did in the field. He disobeyed orders. He was in insurrection. He's accused of everything under the sun. Now, it's one thing to say, no, he doesn't deserve the medal he's been cited for. I think that would have been, you know, not
and the rationale they had there is because that Farran not being because Lise wasn't actually part of 2nd SAS, so therefore a major in the SAS cannot write someone up that's not part of his unit for a medal. That makes sense. It doesn't. It's not fair, but it does. It does. You can understand that being a thing.
I can. And anyway, you know, SOE didn't get medals. That was part of being an SOE. So in a way, that was part and parcel of it. But that's, so we can put that to one side. But it's the deliberate policy to try and trounce his reputation and destroy him as an individual. Now, of course, Farran Lise didn't know this, because he was in hospital, and by the time he got out of hospital, still, you know, in lots of pain and plagued by his injuries, you know, all of that had kind of dissipated, and you know, thank God he didn't know. But of course, I found all those documents in the archives, and when I took them to his daughter, Christine Bueno, who's, you know, chip off the old block, fantastic, feisty, and there she is with her father's medal that the Italians gave him. You know, and I showed her the documents, and I showed her what was said about her father. You can imagine she was, you know, shocked and appalled. But why did that happen? Well, part of me thinks it happened because, as you say, you know, the Mavericks and the Special Forces and the irregular operators were never very popular. And as the war was coming to a close, you know, the regulars took charge. But there's a much more sinister, a much more credible and likely scenario. SOE Italy was actually kind of controlled by or headquartered to a certain extent in Egypt for most of the war. It was kind of filtered through Egypt. There was an individual in the Egypt office who's been proven to have been a Russian spy. Okay, Lise was a vocal supporter of the Chetniks during the Yugoslav war. You know, Lise said what he thought. He was not a diplomat. He'd made it very clear. Lise would fight with anyone. He would use anyone under his command as long as they would fight the Nazis. That's all he cared about. He'd use communists, he'd use Chetniks, and everyone in between. But in SOE headquarters in Egypt, there was an individual who was he's been proven to have been a Russian spy all through the war, a Russian agent. And what that individual did is he actually went and falsified a lot of the documentation in SOE agent files of those who were, in his view, anti-communist, and at least was one of those he identified. And so I believe that individual cooked the books. So Lise was seen as being, you know, beyond the pale, and that's why he was vilified in the way he was. It will probably never be proven. And the interesting thing is, Lise and Farran remained best of buddies all after the war, and they would have these reunions. And Christine Bueno, Lise's daughter, has told me about them, and they would all take the mickey out of Lys because he was the only one there without a string of medals. That was the kind of humour and esprit de corps that they, they kept together.
And the downside of being part of something like the SAS is that although you have incredibly decorated veterans, there aren't many of them. They haven't got the. If you're a guardsman or from a county or the Royal Tank Regiment, you've got a resource behind you to fight cases. But the SAS was such a small, little, tiny part of the British Army. Even if they'd all written letters off, it's not going to make a dent, is it? There's too few people to make a difference.
Paul, by October they were disbanded.
Yeah,
by October 45, the SAS has been disbanded. They were no more. That's how popular they were, Paul. After fighting for all those years of the war, deep behind enemy lines, you could argue doing some pretty fantastic missions and making a difference. They were disbanded because they were not popular. It was merit above rank. It was a classless, institution. That's what Sterling said. Those were two: humour, merit above rank, classless institution, small teams of men deep behind enemy lines. The 5 founding principles. Well, can you imagine those 5 founding principles going down very well in the officers' mess of a guards barrack? It's not really the done thing, is it? So SAS was disbanded by October 45.
And it's weird that even Churchill himself, who instigates this whole, taking the war to the enemy, he's not in power either. He's gone as well.
Churchill's voted out of power, and Churchill is the chairman of the SAS Association. When the SAS is disbanded, Churchill takes over the reins, and he says to Colonel Franks and Paddy Mayne and a few of the other high-ups, we are not going to let this die. One thing, I've been voted out of power, but one thing I will not let die is the SAS, British Commandos, British Special Forces. So they keep it alive secretly, and thank God they did. Yeah.
And this is Mike Leese's beret that from Italy, isn't it? With great stuff. And then you've sent some great photos too. We'll kind of run through some of them as we bring things to an end. And this is Leese back in 49, isn't he? And the other chap, we've already talked about him, isn't it? So remind us who that is.
Yeah, so that's Leese with the commander of the Black Owls. Remember the Special Forces unit that Leese set up? And he's back there because he was invited back in 1949 to be made a freeman of Milan, and also to receive that medal that you saw his daughter with. Yeah. So Leese kept his links. He went back lots of times. He kept his links with Italy all to the end of the war, and even to this day, every year on the anniversary of the assault on the headquarters buildings, they have a reunion. I mean, it happened this year, even in the middle of COVID. There it is. That's the reunion. And this lady here on the right, she's a veteran who was there. She's one of the staffetters. She is one of the young Italian resistance heroines who bicycled through enemy lines gathering intelligence. So every year, even during COVID, they have a reunion at the headquarters buildings. So we have,
Sorry, and how familiar is it, Damien, that it's the actual people within country who remember these things? I mean, me living in France, how often is it that the local villagers in France remember these things long beyond the military hierarchy has forgotten? You go to these places in Italy and France and Netherlands, and there's these little plaques tended by these dedicated locals who have little private museums and collections and banquets and things, and yet our own government has kind of abandoned them to the wolves years ago. We go off on a tangent about that kind of stuff, but thank God for people like yourself writing these books and getting them back in. There's so few SAS veterans from World War II, and they all know each other because they get seconded to this unit for this jump, and they go from theater to theater, and it's a really, really important story to tell, and you told it brilliantly tonight. So has there been any kind of happy ending in terms of Mike's daughter? Is there anything, any official acknowledgement of the fact he was treated badly, or is it all still left?
It's ongoing. The campaign is ongoing to try and get him properly recognized and exonerated. I mean, I've had messages this week from a wonderful woman in the UK who keeps lobbying the minister and the various authorities to get Leese's a record put straight and to get him properly honored. There's a petition which has got thousands of signatures. It's ongoing, but as Christine Bueno, Leese's daughter, says, he wasn't in it for the medals. He wasn't in it for the glory. He was one of those individuals who fought for all the right reasons. And he's one of those individuals. Going back to the question you raised earlier, did any of these small scale operations really make any difference? Well, yes, they did. On occasion, they did. If that's the key point, okay, and it's in the book. What did it achieve? Well, I'll tell you what it achieved. It shortened the war in Italy by days, weeks. How many Allied lives does that equate to saved?
Yeah,
How many Italian lives does that equate to saved? And let's be frank about it. How many German lives does that equate to being saved? Yeah?
Yeah.
That's a hell of an achievement.
Absolutely. And I don't like speaking for people who have passed, but that said, I'm sure if you asked these guys and you said, would you rather be remembered in the village where you did this? Would you rather be remembered by people like that? Or would you be rather remembered by some official document coming through signed by some secretary? What they'd have chosen. Of course they would choose to be recognized there and be respected among their peers. That's the thing as well. Yeah. I do want to address, of course, there were a couple of three fatalities on the mission itself. So these are three of the guys who didn't make it. So one who was serving under a fake name, Robert Bruce was his serving name, but Giusto Balerdi, Stanley Bolden, and Sidney Guscott. The two Brits are buried in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Milan. And of course, as the weeks ensued, there were more casualties and wounded as they're doing this hit and run operation there. So the Operation Tombola itself was, as you stressed, was the starting point of several more weeks of daring do, I suppose, the best way to describe it. So, I mean, it's absolutely been enthralling. People have absolutely loved this. And again, I'm stressing it again. You've only given the absolute highlights of this. It's absolutely worth getting a book. And as I said to you the last time with the SAS Band of Brothers, the thing is, you're going to have to keep finding these stories. You can't go backwards now. You can't start writing about, machine fitters repairing engines on trucks. You're going to have to keep pulling out books of this quality. So I don't know how many more you've got in you, but
the amazing thing about it is the more you dig, the more you find. You know how many stories that haven't been told from World War II? Just extraordinary.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah. I mean, this is what we did. I talked about historical fiction the other week on a show, and I'm thinking, why bother spending a year making up a story when you can spend a year researching a real one and honoring real people? It's one is more rewarding than the other. But anyway, that's another subject for the day. But anything in terms of can any people help with signing this petition? Is there anything people can do?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, if you go to the petition page, which we should have I should have sent you a link. How do we do that?
To the description tomorrow. I'll do it afterwards.
Yeah, do that. Put the link up. Yeah, get signing the petition. Spread the word, please do. We're still trying to get some kind of recompense for Michael Leese. He is the standout hero of the book, and the difference is Farran is well known. Farran is a legendary figure in the SAS. Leese was an incredible warrior. Farran, after the book was published, the Telegraph did a few articles on the Leese story, and Farran wrote a fax to Christine Bueno, Mike Leese's daughter, the day Mike Leese passed away, and he said he was a Viking warrior without compare. That's Roy Farran, a legendary commander in the SAS. So that's the standing of the man who masterminds the German headquarters raid.
Yeah, and this, I mean, we will end it in a minute, but this does have a proven. It does shorten the war. It does save lives. But even if it hadn't done, there's still this respect for people who just want to do stuff and take the war to people. That if we don't have the Farrans and the Leases and all the other people we've written about, we don't win the war. You've got to have people who are prepared. It's supposedly why the Czechs dropped in to assassinate Heydrich. One of them says there are times in life you have to take a side, isn't it? You've got to make a stand, and you can stand by and watch, or you can actually go and do stuff and take a side. And these people took a side. They took a side against tyranny and evil. It's a trite comment, but it's absolutely true, isn't it? And
it's absolutely true. It's what they were charged to do by Churchill in our darkest hour. In those months weeks after Dunkirk. That's what he charged these men to do. He said, "Go out and do the impossible. strike fear into the enemy deep behind their lines. Don't let any of them sleep soundly in their beds at night. Set Europe ablaze. And that's exactly what those men went out to do, and women. And when you then tell them that you can't do this anymore because the war's almost won and the politics have changed, it doesn't mean anything to them. They're there to fight tyranny. And no one's going to stop them.
You've unleashed the beast. You can't just put the beast back in the cage now and say stop being a beast. It's. But then that's what governments do. That we'll go off on a tangent with that. But anyway, I'll come back and say thank you to you in a second, Dem. I'll just remind people we've got coming up. So again, you've got to get the book. I mean, any of Damien's books are worth getting, but this one is just. If you're interested in the Italian campaign and the Gothic line, it's just fantastic reading. Every page is like a script from a movie. In terms of tomorrow, it's interesting that Damien mentioned this reputation the Italian military have. We've got a panel discussion about the Italian Navy tomorrow. So 3 guests. We're going to talk about this myth about the Italian Navy not being very good and actually make this very valid point that the Navy that the British were worried about, certainly in 41, 42, was the Italian Navy, not the Kriegsmarine. So stay tuned for that tomorrow night, same time, 7 o'clock UK time. And then the following day, we've got Julian Whippy coming on talking about the Battle of Medicina in 45. So a 2-hour battle. We're talking about Gurkhas and the 14th, 20th Hussars. So that'd be really cool. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to Damien Lewis for joining us. As usual, folks, the links to buying the books, the links to Damien's website, all in the description below. And I will add, once Damien sent it to me, the link with the petition that you can all go and sign to try and make a difference with regards to this injustice. So, well, have you enjoyed it, Damien? Has it been good?
Yeah, as ever. Brilliant. Thank you, my friend.
I've loved it. So, again, folks, thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting us. Check us out on Patreon. Check all the links, and I will see you all again tomorrow to talk about the Italian Navy. So thanks for watching. Have a good evening. This is Paul Woodadge and Damien Lewis for World War II TV saying it's been fun. It's been a blast. Who dares wins.
Absolutely.